Welcome to Isaga Square Table. I hope you can all see the slide. We have an interesting evening today. I'm your host, Gilbert van Zel, for tonight. Let me take you to the housekeeping rules before we start. We have muted you all, and please keep muting your microphone. But our presentator is asking especially to share some videos as it will help to give the presentation. There will be no slides this time, but a very good story. Make sure that you appear on Teams with the same first name, last name for registration to acquire your CPAs, and the presentation will be recorded along with without the slides. And there are questions during the session can be asked by using the chat or raise hand. And as a moderator, I will give a good moment and introduce you to the speaker, because she cannot handle it herself. Then our speaker today, Melanie Riebach, but she will introduce herself. It's a very long story, interesting story we will get, and therefore, with no further ado, I will give over the presentation to Melanie. Melanie, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. So great. So today's presentation is called Avant-Garde Infosec. Not usually words, of course, that we're used to hearing in the same sentence. And of course, leading to a number of questions by what exactly do we mean? I'm going to start anyhow today just by telling some stories. I don't know how many of you here already know who I am or know anything at all about my company. But the first thing I will tell you just a little bit about myself is that my name is Melanie Riebach, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Radically Open Security. So we are the world's first not-for-profit computer security consultancy company. When I say not-for-profit, what does that mean? Well, actually, we've got a very odd business model, but essentially we give 90% of our profits to the NLNet Foundation using basically this archaic thing called a fiscal fundraising institution, which essentially comes from the Dutch church. Because churches sometimes want to do a commercial spin-off of some kind, raise some money, and that money goes with a tax benefit back to the church. I believe there's some auditors present at today's gathering. This thing in Dutch is called a fiscaal fondswerkende instelling. It's actually a tax construction. The most famous example of this is Regina Caeli, a language institute, otherwise known as the Nonnen van Vught, the nuns of Vught. And the nuns, basically, they started this language institute independently operating, and its profits go back to the nuns. That's how it works. So we essentially did the same thing, except that we decided that we were going to make our commercial spin-off a cybersecurity company, and our so-called church, the NLNet Foundation. And NLNet is a Aanbiedstichting, a charitable foundation that has supported open source digital rights and anything for a better internet for roughly the past 30 years. So they give the money onwards to things like GNU, Tor, Jitsi, EFF, DNSSEC, WireGuard, all kinds of great projects that make the internet better. So a not-for-profit company, so far, we've given almost €750,000 to NLNet. And it's kind of a funny thing because we are a 8-year-old company, roughly. We've got about also 50 staff members. But of course, when I first started this thing, when I told people I was going to create a company that gives all of its money away to charity, of course, everyone thought I was crazy, right? Not to mention people didn't understand how I would be able to pull such a thing off, or even how you could run a company that way. So basically, I also consider Radically Open Security to be an activistic organization. And one of the things that I like to get people to think about is, the business can be one of the most effective forms of activism. We don't always think about it this way. Business also can be a mixed media for art, right? I mean, kind of like, you have painters and sculptors and they have their own palettes for making art. Like, why can't we do this with IT? Why can't we do this with cybersecurity or with hacking, right? Business can be a vehicle for even spiritual expression or creativity, but we're not used to approaching it in this way. It's odd that we don't, though, because, of course, a lot of what happens in InfoSec, it's all very related to the hacker community. And, of course, the hacker community is also super related to the open source community. Also, all of which are super idealistic, and that very much are about activism and creating a better world. And yet somehow this all gets sidelined and, just sort of prepackaged into corporations and the big four, and to a certain extent, us just sort of forgetting the fact that actually what we're doing with security and privacy, is, I mean, to me, security really should be, something of the public good, and privacy should be a sustainable development goal. It's not, but I think that it should be. Now, the thing is here that in general, what we're trying to achieve with cybersecurity comes into direct conflict with the business models of the organizations that we're running in the name of promoting these goals. I can give you an example. Take a antivirus company, right? So if you have an antivirus engine, of course, as you probably know, an antivirus engine by itself is not all that worthwhile, right? I mean, it needs signatures that it's able to match to, because if you have no signatures to match to, the AV engine by itself is not going to be doing much. But the problem is, generally, this AV engine is given away for free, while the signatures are sold on a subscription basis. But think about this. By selling these signatures, it's like having access to this, to the vaccine, to this sickness that's affecting anyone. And I will only give it to you if you buy it from me. Yeah, there must be some better way. The funny thing is, nowadays, I think that there has been a lot of validation of things like open source business models. Right. Especially if we look at the DevOps community. I mean, there's so many examples of really great DevOps companies, Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Docker, Elastic, that have essentially, adopted this open source business model, which basically means give away the product, sell the services. Right. And essentially, you can build a perfectly good service offering. I mean, Radically Open Security also is a services company. We sell pen tests for the most part. So, with the occasional incident response and phishing test thrown in. But, but at the end of the day, I mean, this is a perfectly reasonable business to start. It's asset light. It doesn't take a whole lot of money to really get started. All you really need to do, it's like the best of platform business, right? Essentially match your producers with your consumers, and what you've got is something that is perfectly scalable. However, of course, with open source, a lot of the larger companies, they have a number of objections, and they will say things like, oh, but services aren't scalable, at which point I'm just like, yeah, look at Uber and Airbnb and tell me again how services aren't scalable. Yeah, the world has changed, and thus the business models, of course, need to change with it. And this antiquated thinking also needs to go. Similarly, also other things like saying, yeah, but if we're giving this away for free, how do we know our competitor is not going to steal it? Yeah. It's actually really hard to steal things nowadays. Like, let's say I put some software up on GitHub. In fact, I do. I mean, Radically Open Security has released the core of its entire pen testing workflow. We've open sourced it, and we've even made it an OWASP project. It's called OWASP Pentext. Feel free to look it up. But the point is that just because you put something online as open source, first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to use it, because of course we certainly hope that it would. But getting users, of course, is always a thing. But beyond that, if you're going to steal somebody else's software, here's the problem: you have to maintain it. And as great of a software developer as you might think you are, whatever you've created is probably buggy. You know, and it's a whole lot of work to be able to maintain somebody else's software, particularly if you don't have access to the developers. Yeah, and then, you know, taking this basically one step further, let's say I'm going to take this open source thing and I'm going to create an independent fork of it. You know, you need to do things like merge in patches from the upstream, right? Because there's going to be critical things, you know, in addition to functionality, security patches, not unimportant, you know, and it's actually much harder to maintain your own independent branch of something, you know, basically cherry picking and merging the patches rather than just taking the changes that you make and migrating them back upstream. So it's actually a lot more work to steal something, ironically enough, than it is to contribute to an active open source project. So, you know, when you start to unpack some of these objections to open source, some of them really start to fall apart. And the last thing, of course, is just the backwards business model of, you know, in today's internet, it's not that, you know, first you monetize it and then you get the users. That's not how it works. I mean, basically, you know, first you get the users, then you monetize them. I mean, essentially, by selling something proprietary, you are also putting a financial barrier to entry from people using your stuff. So, you know, for all of these reasons, you know, not giving things away actually doesn't make sense. And on top of that, also giving things away for free, particularly as open source, is the best marketing that you can find. And tech evangelism, again, pointing back to the DevOps industry, you can see how well it has worked for building really large, thriving companies. Anyhow, but the really great thing, though, you know, with a lot of the cybersecurity industry, there's a whole lot of black boxes that are getting sold. You know, a lot of these black box, it can be for monitoring, you know, intrusion detection, IDS, IPS, threat analysis. I mean, there's all kinds of different proprietary boxes. I mean, even SCADA, you know. But the problem, of course, with these black boxes also is that you don't know what's in there. And this also creates a kind of vendor lock-in. So if I buy this black box, then let's say at a certain point in time, I decide that I want to stop paying for it. You know, if it's a proprietary box, you basically have to give it back, and all of that knowledge that was gained in the course of running the monitoring tool, you know, the analysis algorithms, whatever it is that you're running, you had no sight on how that worked, which basically means that you are completely back to square one, you know, and then you have to go looking for a new solution. Another thing that people also don't spend enough time thinking about with these black boxes is that it's a governance problem. Yeah, I can illustrate this also with some extremely well-known examples. Let's take a well-known company like, say, Fox IT, right? You know, they created black boxes, monitoring black boxes that were in almost every part of the Dutch government, large corporations, defense. I mean, they were basically everywhere. And then one day they were acquired by the British NCC group. You know, the entire, you know, Dutch government and then corporate world all of a sudden let out a collective, oh shit, our data is going to the British, pardon my language. And then, you know, they all really jumped ship, and then they ran to a different startup that was making similar black boxes. That was also a spinoff of Fox, by the way. That was called Red Sox. You know, but of course, you know, Red Sox, of course, is you know, VC funded, you know, grew exponentially. 2 years later, I read the press release again. Congratulations, Red Sox. They were just acquired by the Romanians. When are we going to learn? You know, speaking of which, I should also send my congratulations for Cybersprint that also just got acquired a month ago. But the point is, I mean, I can barely think of a single Dutch cybersecurity company of roughly the age and size of my own company, and again, we're roughly 50 people and about 8 years old, that hasn't been acquired? Name one. Seriously. But this is a tremendously huge problem because, we are putting our faith in these organizations, but the problem, though, is they are being designed to be sold, and not the product, but the company. This whole system, though, it has a deeper systemic cause, and this deeper systemic cause is really just business incubation itself and the whole system of incubators that we have surrounding it. So, for example, most of us, I believe, are from the Netherlands. Let's take a nice local example, the Hague Security Delta, right? So, I'm a cybersecurity founder. I want to create my company, so I'm going to go to the Hague, and probably the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to introduce me to a whole bunch of VCs. Yeah. I get funded, I do a startup boot camp. One of the very first things that I see is a PowerPoint slide shoved in front of my nose that has a picture of an exponential curve on it. They will point to it and say, do that. And your definition of success as an entrepreneur is the exit. In other words, if I can either sell my company or I can IPO it, then I am, I've got it made. I am now a successful cybersecurity entrepreneur. If you can do this multiple times, great. Even better, you're a serial entrepreneur. Now you have really made it. If you want to take the next step of success after that, then you can become a VC. Fantastic. So, but, we're not really thinking about whether or not this system is actually helping to make us cyber secure. I mean, some people are making a whole lot of money. We can't argue that one. But is this actually really making normal average people, is this ensuring that our digital stuff isn't going to wind up on the dark web, next week, or even that anyone is respecting our privacy despite GDPR at all? Again, and speaking of GDPR, our business models are in conflict with our actual human rights here. So, so then this, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You make a point and very well put that, but also the open source model is also not a guarantee for continuity of a company. Can you reflect on that?
Absolutely. So the open source model is not a guarantee for business continuity. That is completely correct. Really great example is, for example, do you guys all remember Madison Gurka? I mean, okay, they're called Secura now. You must, okay. I'm sure some of you know Secura.
Yeah, we know them, yeah.
They started as a super open source friendly company. I'm actually, friendly. I was actually on the board of the Netherlands Unix user group with one of the founders, Walter Belgers. Back in the day, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for 20 years, but anyway, they were definitely one of the more sort of open source friendly, Unix oriented clubs that I was familiar with. But again, at a certain point, they wound up getting acquired. And I believe that Secura also got acquired again. And I think there was some kind of an offshore drilling company. I have no idea what their affinity is with cybersecurity company. But at a certain point, I mean, they're basically just playing games with the shares, essentially. So, of course, the other thing also is during the exit, it always represents a kind of watering down of the company. So all the original open source friendly founders, they left. I mean, fairly shortly after the company was acquired. And at that point, oftentimes the company just sort of gets absorbed into whatever larger, merger that they find themselves a part of now. So you're right, open source won't get us there. But there's another construction that will. And it's called steward ownership. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with social enterprise and also in general some of the entity forms that are frequently used. But steward ownership, essentially, It means a couple different things. It means a separation of profit rights and voting rights, first of all. But more importantly, and the part of steward ownership I think is the most important, is they make it impossible to sell the company. So they have something that's called the golden share. It's also called a poison pill. And basically the way that it works is you give a single voting share of the company to, for example, the German Purpose Foundation that is behind the steward ownership movement. This single voting share, it does not have any profit rights whatsoever. So basically they can't make any money from it. But the one thing that this share can do is it can veto the sale of the company. So, these kinds of constructions are really helpful. Another thing also that I did with Radically Open Security, and this is going to sound, again, very odd. There was a time when I was the sole owner of Radically Open Security. I owned 100% of the shares. I made the somewhat unusual decision to sell all of the shares of my company for €1 to a foundation. Not assuming that everyone's going to immediately start doing this. It's the usual joke, worst sale ever. But, I don't actually have a moment of regret from having made this decision. Okay, that's not entirely true. Occasionally, if my staff is annoying, maybe I'll have a moment of regret, but then I sleep well and the next day I'm feeling better. But no, but seriously. But the point is that what it basically means is that the company is basically, it's not even mine anymore. The company basically belongs to itself, right? And what you can do then is, first of all, just make sure you have people on the board of the stichting to make sure also that they protect the mission of the foundation. And then the last additional piece that should be added is, again, the golden share. Again, also just to make sure that the board can't collude to sell the company at that point. So at that point, you've got not entirely watertight, because of course even social business models have an attacker model. And even these legal contracts need to be pen tested. I mean, because there's always ways, you have to think about how to collude and think about ways to cheat, and the usual skills that we have as pen testers we can also use to pen test our contracts. But basically what we're attempting to do is eliminate the financial extraction from the company, on the hypothesis that if you remove the financial extraction from business, all that's left is social impact. Because if nobody's going to get super ultra rich from this, then what other purpose is there besides social impact? So, I think that a lot of this, it starts to get a bit philosophical, but it's actually also surprisingly practical. I started a incubator 4 years ago called Nonprofit Ventures, where I've actually been helping other founders to create similar not-for-profit companies, but then in other industries. So we've actually run 3 cohorts through our program, and we've had almost 50 founders that are going through our program because they're interested in not-for-profit business models and also cross-subsidization of charity. So this is kind of another way to do it, but of course you need to realize that it's possible, and it sort of helps if you have a template for doing it, and also if you have a community and role models that you can look at so you don't feel quite so alone. The funny thing is, Radically Open Security also has been doing some mentoring as a service for the European Commission. And you would think, that's interesting. Why would the EC be interested in this particular business model? Now, the funny thing is, we've been doing this as part of NGI Tetra. So NGI Tetra is the valorization arm of NGI Zero, where NGI is next generation internet. And what we're doing is they essentially give me the founders, and this is going to sound weird, but the founders that actually don't want to have companies. Sounds odd, right? But it's actually not really, because if you think about open source projects, oftentimes the founders of open source projects really have no interest whatsoever in business or entrepreneurship. They just have their project and they want it to be cool. It's the same thing with academics. They also want to build these really great, awesome projects that solve something fundamental, and they want to give it away free to the world. They have very little interest in VCs and in playing games with businesses. But the problem, though, is like, let's say I'm an academic at a university. I've done government funded research, but it's time that I want to spin this off. What's going to happen? And by the way, this isn't a hypothetical example either, because I used to be an assistant professor of computer science at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And I also have, my one failed startup story. Every entrepreneur has it. When I was basically creating something called the RFID Guardian, I wanted to create a company for it. So what I did is, of course, I went to the Technology Transfer Office, the TTO, at the university. The very first thing after you go to the TTO as an academic that's going to happen is, number one, they will ask you to patent everything that moves. And then number two, they're going to say, and by the way, here's a incubator, go talk to them. And then, of course, the incubator, the next thing that they're going to do is straight away introduce you to a VC. But this is actually really a problem. And it's very well articulated by an economist. Her name is Mariana Mazzucato, and she wrote a really excellent book called The Entrepreneurial State. So her thesis is that the government is the world's largest VC. I mean, basically, they're pumping money into fundamental research like no one else, because they are, of course, giving all these grants and subsidies that are going to academic researchers at the universities, but they're also giving all kinds of subsidies for the industry, not to mention tax cuts. Most of the great innovations that we have nowadays, much of this, of course, is funded by the government. The problem, though, is the moment, of course, that the TTO steps in and then pushes the academics in the direction of the VCs, for a relatively small investment, are now getting the majority of the profit rights. It's completely disproportionate. And the way that Mariana Mazzucato puts it is, she says that we are socializing the costs and privatizing the benefits. This is precisely the reason why university technology transfer offices, but really anything related to government in general, should be very, very interested in not-for-profit business models and steward ownership. It's quite simply because what we really want to do is we want to socialize the costs and socialize the benefits. Because ultimately this is going to be what's best for our citizens. It's also the same thing with post-COVID economic recovery. We had all these discussions about, okay, and the new normal, what exactly is it that we need to be doing? Well, there's a couple different ways to approach it. I mean, what the Dutch government did is we had some really large initiatives, like, for example, the Nationale Groeifonds, the National Growth Fund, that, of course, was pumping cash into all kinds of large projects, but also a lot of different companies and VC funds. But there's a different way to approach this. If you think about incubators, if you go back in time, you go back in history, the very first startup incubator ever was called the Batavia Industrial Center, and it was located in Batavia, New York. Joe Minusco was a wealthy citizen of Batavia, and Batavia was an industry town. At a certain point, the industry, well, they moved out of the town, right? So, the people were poor after the industry was gone. And Joe Minusco, he owned, the restaurant and the movie theater. And, he wanted the people in Batavia to be prosperous enough that they would still be able to patronize his theater, his restaurant, all these things. So what he did is he bought this really large empty building, which he dubbed the Batavia Industrial Center, and he bought shared facilities, things like, desks, paper, administrative and secretarial and paper supplies, and all the things basically that you would need to get a company started. And then he's basically, the definition of success at the Batavia Industrial Center was when a founder could graduate their company from the BIC to actually having their own office on Main Street. One of the first tenants in the BIC was the Mount Hope chicken hatchery. And at one point in time, a journalist came through the compound, and they saw all these little baby chickens running around. And that was when Joe Manusco said, yeah, so here at Mount Hope, they're incubating chickens. But I guess here at BIC, we must be incubating startups. That's actually where the name Startup Incubator came from. So, so this is the thing, but fast forward now to many years later, and you got the modern tech incubators. Examples of this, for example, was an early incubator from Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari, and he also created the Chuck E. Cheese pizza restaurants in the United States. What he did is he instead created a incubator, but then took his fortune from Atari and essentially took all of his own ideas. And for him, it was basically just like buying a number of lottery tickets. He basically made a number of small bets across his different ideas, and he was just trying to maximize his returns on the whole thing. So some percentage of his ideas succeeded. In other words, they wound up getting sold. A whole large other number of them failed. And that worked for Nolan Bushnell. But this was really a different objective. This wasn't necessarily even about the companies themselves, but it was about maximizing Nolan Bushnell's returns. This model got further adopted and was also promoted by somebody named Paul Graham, who started a really famous incubator called Y Combinator. Paul Graham is a bit of a, shall we say, controversial character. He wrote a blog post, well, he's written many blog posts, but one in particular where he literally said in these words, and I quote, "I am a manufacturer of income inequality." So you can't claim that these guys don't know what they're doing. But despite all this, it is a good way of maximizing your returns. But still, because this is successful, then of course the Y Combinator model wound up getting copied, and thus you got Techstars and 500 startups, and which also eventually got copied into the Rock Starts and the Startup Boot Camps and all the sort of Y Combinator style incubation programs that we have in the Netherlands. Much of this narrative also is about unicorns. The great hallowed unicorn, right? And a unicorn, for those of you who don't know, this is a company with a $1 billion valuation. And we've got, up until the very top of the Dutch government, we've got Prince Constantine, at TechLeap, telling us, shouting from the rooftops, we need more unicorns in the Netherlands. Do we? Let's unpack this here. So what exactly really is a unicorn here? So the problem here is that we're taking our startups and we are treating them like, in Dutch, you would call them plofkippen. In English, it's called battery chickens. So we're artificially force feeding them with investment capital so they can grow artificially quickly, so they can get a really juicy and plump and attractive looking, up until the moment where they are liquidated, which is the VC term for the exit, which is when that value is pulled out of the company and there's a slightly dysfunctional carcass of the company remaining. All right, but let's look at this even further. Any kind of hyper growth is going to be revenue losing, right? Because if you look at the actual costs of most companies, people are always the largest expense. With these unicorns, the problem, and most people don't know this, is that 90% of unicorns are losing money. 90%. And I'm not talking about new unicorns, but all unicorns, ever. And what's happening here is it's basically like pulling a pump and dump scheme onto the public markets. So what we're doing is we're taking this inherently revenue-losing thing, we're hyping it up, making all kinds of noise in the media, and basically dumping it onto the public markets. And if it's revenue-losing pre-IPO, well, guess what? It's probably still going to be revenue-losing post-IPO. The problem, though, is that most people are still buying it because of something called the greater fool theory. It doesn't actually matter what you're buying, as long as there's a greater fool who's willing to come and buy it and pay more than you did. And this works for IPOs, but also for the stock market in general, also cryptocurrency, tulips, you name it. But again, is this actually getting us where we need to go? I mean, not to mention begging the question, should this kind of pump and dump scheme even be legal? But this aside. But what else is happening here, and most people also don't ask the question, is, okay, you've got these revenue-losing unicorns, like, say, WeWork, that's spending money 5 times faster than it's gaining it. Whose money are these revenue-bleeding unicorns spending? Right? We don't really stop and think about this. Now, if you follow the money, 65% of VC funds, especially in the United States, are funded by pension funds. Our retirement money. Okay, what's happening here? Now, pension funds these days are desperate. And the reason why they're desperate is quite simply low interest rates. All the really safe investments that they're used to having, like bonds, they are now worthless. Of course, we all know we've been getting negative interest on our bank accounts, so they're moving to so-called riskier asset classes like VC. But the problem is that 85% of VCs in the last 25 years have failed to keep pace with the stock market. In other words, they're making all kinds of promises like 10x growth, 20x, whatever, make it as crazy as you want. But if you had literally bought an index fund and held it for 25 years, you would have done better than 25% of VCs. So what's happening here really is that all of this money essentially is getting directed. So the pension funds basically are paying after the IPO as the stock tanks because these revenue things are losing money. They're bleeding money on the front side, into these revenue losing VC funds. The real question we need to ask is, and 9 out of 10 startups also are failing, which also isn't that great. So who in the system is winning? And the only answer I can give is the fund managers, and the lucky few founders of these unicorns that basically get it to the IPO and then they get out early. But and the thing is with these fund managers is their financial incentive structure is something called the 2 and 20 model. So basically 2% of the assets under management in the VC funds. And then there's 20%, something called carry, which is a performance incentive that if you exit the company, then basically they get 20% of that sale value or of the value of the IPO. And this 20% carry, this performance incentive, this is what embeds the growth imperative into startups. Now, I'm going to bring all of this back to cybersecurity. We have thus constructed this whole system where basically the fact that we are not creating tech companies, but we are creating vehicles for moving capital around. And when you say the word unicorn, what we're actually creating is pension fund subsidized monopoly forming. If you look at the successful companies in cybersecurity, people will point to things like Palantir. First of all, ignoring the fact that the company is completely morally bankrupt, when Palantir had filed its paperwork for its IPO, which of course is the very first moment that we can actually look inside the financials, what we found out about Palantir is that not only were they losing money in the rate of like hundreds of millions of euros per year, but they were also spending more money on their marketing budget than on research and development. But again, this is just a pure case of, you've got Peter Thiel, he's an investor, and they're just playing this game, again, this pump and dump scheme. But this is our vision of success for the cybersecurity industry. The Palantirs and the companies that are like it. We need to stop playing these games. We've got the cybersecurity we've got the cybercrime ecosystem. And the problem here is that these cyber criminals, they are collaborating, they are working together, and they have basically an industry full of collaborative moving parts, right? So you've got some cyber criminals that are making the malware, other ones that are making the droppers, other ones that are making, you've got some of them doing help desk duties, some of them doing translations, right? And
I have a question, Melanie.
Yes, go ahead.
Good point. Saber Ferjani is having a question. Maybe he can put it himself. You can.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Melanie. So I'd like just to come back to the different type of structure, especially if a group of people, instead of, there are, of course, a lot of bad examples of company taking the wrong steps, and especially in cybersecurity and in part of the industry, and where people make the customer really scared of something, and then they sell them a bunch of services that most of them are not necessarily relevant or useful, and then a lot of reports and so on. But anyway, besides cybersecurity, let's take the example of a regular company where, not a company actually, a group of people enthusiastic about a product or a service or a field, including, for example, cybersecurity, and they bootstrap a company, for-profit company, from their own money, or 3F, or even borrow money if needed, without going through VC. So that I fully agree with you. But then still make a for-profit company and still reinvest most of the profit, for example, to do research and development, to do develop for open source, to support, for example, interns, collaboration with universities, all of that. This is also a form of activism, but in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily need to go completely through the non-profit. So it still can be for profit because those people took a lot of risk, invested of their precious time and money and so on to create this company out of nowhere. And probably they deserve to extract some of the profit, but not the exaggerated profit, not to the extent that you're describing. So what do you think about that? Is it still something you can support, that we can still use the ordinary way of creating companies, but not going to the really scary part of extracting too much profit and paying back this VC and so on?
Right. So bootstrapped companies, bootstrapped cybersecurity companies that are for profit give you results like Fox IT. They were bootstrapped at the beginning. I believe at a certain point they brought in a VC for growth capital, but they most certainly didn't need it because they had a very thriving company that they'd started by selling cybersecurity services. And as I said before, it's extremely easy actually to bootstrap a cybersecurity company. I can tell you, I've done it. But the main thing is that it's the moment of sale that is the extraction. It's not even so much the salaries. Look, I think that entrepreneurs, and everyone really, deserves a nice, comfortable middle-class existence, right? We have mortgages to pay, we have kids to put through school, we have to put bread on the table, and of course, we should all be entitled to middle-class salaries and pensions. However, there's a huge difference between a middle-class salary, maybe 6 figures and a nice pension versus getting tens of millions or more. Huge difference. I don't think that anyone deserves necessarily to extract that. This is the problem with the system. This is what's creating inequality in the world. So, but again, when you say for profit, the reason why it sounds perfectly reasonable, your question does sound perfectly reasonable, is because there's a lot of ambiguity in the word profit itself. So when we talk about profit, it has two meanings. Okay, the first meaning of the word profit is what I would call reinvested margin. So let's say that I sell you, let's say I buy a banana for 20 cents and I sell you that banana for €1. That's 80 cents that I put onto that banana. That is called the margin. And then what I do is I take that 80 cents and then I reinvest that into building my banana company. Because, I have to pay my suppliers, I have to pay my staff, I have to pay for marketing, IT, automation, the whole 9 yards. That's how I build my company. So reinvestment is the first meaning of the word profit. The second meaning of the word profit is extraction, and that is what pays for my private yacht and my Maserati and my jet, all these things that are completely inessential for running a business. So when people say, well, of course my company has to be profitable, if you're talking about reinvestment, I totally agree with you, right? But if you're talking about financial extraction, not only is it unhelpful, but it is even a competitive disadvantage on the market. Because all of that money that you are pulling out to enrich basically a very small number of people, that is money that you are not putting into building better products and services, paying your staff better, making the prices lower for your customers, making sure you're not externalizing your costs onto society and the environment, all of these kinds of things. So the problem really here is that because these two meanings of the word profit are sort of baked into the same word, it really confuses us in our heads. That confusion then is also extended when you talk about anything not for profit. When I tell people I'm running a not-for-profit cybersecurity company, the first thing they think is, oh, you work for free, or you have volunteers. I'm like, no. We don't work for free, but we're a social enterprise, and we charge market-conform rates to our customers, and we pay market-conform rates to our staff because they also have kids to put through school and mortgages to pay off. You can't survive on the market if you don't reinvest. But when you use the word not-for-profit, it's that double meaning again, because what people assume, what I'm trying to do is get rid of the extraction, but then people automatically assume that you also can't reinvest. And of course, you need that. Like with radically open security, I like to tell people just because we're not-for-profit doesn't mean we're cheap. And they'll tell you we're not cheap. I mean, oftentimes we are charging, $150 an hour, $200 an hour, for some of our security services. We are most certainly market conform in our rates, and I pay my staff pretty well too, So, but the point is, I reinvest in building my company, which means that I have to pay for all kinds of overhead, like project management, IT and infrastructure, automation, finance, business development. I'm overhead. I need to get a salary too. So, all of these things basically are reinvestment. And if I also know that I have a big expenditure coming up for next year, I can create a reserve for it. For example, in 2020, I had to migrate to a new data center. So, that stuff costs money. But you only really talk about profits after all of that has been taken care of. So the profits of 90% of whom that we give away and cross-subsidize to charity, that is only the part that you would otherwise be dividending out to your shareholders. It's basically the money we don't need. And that last 10% I don't give away is the cash flow buffer, which is basically the amount of money that my company has that enables us to be able to pay, basically make payroll at the end of every month. So it's a bit of a ballet with money, but we make it work. And not only have we built a successful cybersecurity company, but really a thriving one, with a not-for-profit business model. But again, this double meaning, it means that things like NGOs, they have to be not-for-profit. But, of course, we should eliminate financial extraction from NGOs, but they also assume that they can't reinvest. And of course, with most NGOs that rely on things like donations and subsidies, especially with the modern political climate, these funding sources are drying up. So they, more than anyone, need to create companies to create, sustainable cash streams for their activism. But the problem is, if a NGO wants to start behaving like a company, they're literally they're putting themselves at existential risk, because the tax authorities, the Belastingdienst, might revoke their charitable status, their ANBI status, which from that point forward means that the donations are no longer tax deductible. That's the kind of thing that really can put an NGO in danger. So they're basically in something that I call the subsidy trap, which is basically they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, in making their situation better and more sustainable, versus, losing their charitable status. So this is a really huge problem. Yeah.
Of course, what you're saying is true for many companies. Is this more true for, in your point of view, for security companies? And can you enlighten this with the link to security companies then?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's important in every industry, but I can't talk about other industries. I can really only talk about cybersecurity because this is the industry that I happen to be in. So I do think that these ideas apply in a lot of other places. But I think particularly in cybersecurity, we need to understand that the world of cybercrime is unified. They work together, they collaborate. If the attackers, with all of their moving parts that fit into this larger system, if they work together, then how can we as defenders think that we can maintain silos, commercial, proprietary silos, and think that we will ever win? And this is the problem coming back to these proprietary black boxes. We are creating hundreds of small wheels, that then usually could disappear or get absorbed into something else, rather than one or two or three much larger wheels, that could be much better and freely available to everyone. Coming back to open source, the great thing about open source is that it's basically crowdfunding the production of, a large amount of intellectual property through paying customers. And what that means is that then becomes open and available to everyone. So if we as defenders think that we are going to have even the slightest bit of a chance of winning, the only way that we can do this is by collaborating, by being open, by sharing. It's no coincidence that a lot of the best initiatives in the cybersecurity industry are things that are sharing. I mean, just consider, sharing of indicators of compromise, all the threat intel sharing initiatives that are out there. Look at the National Cybersecurity Center in The Hague and all of the ISACs, the industry vertical groups that they're facilitating for the sharing of threat information and experiences. I used to be on the cybercrime team of ING Bank, and one time during an incident, we were facing a DDoS, and literally the firewall team picked up the phone and called the Rabobank to ask for firewall rules. Because at the end of the day, in cybersecurity, your company has no competitors. The only one that we're fighting against is the bad guys, are the cyber criminals. So anything
I like the sharing very much, yes. I know this from hospitals, but also I worked in development aid, and yeah, sharing is very important. Yeah. And it helps against inequality.
Yeah. And that's precisely why I'm trying to fight against these commercial business models, because I think that they are holding us back and they are preventing us from actually winning. Because as long as we continue competing with one another, or not sharing the innovations that we're building, then it is going to be that much harder for us to really, and this is the reason why many of these open and data sharing initiatives, this is why they're all happening by universities, national CSIRTs, Shadow Server. I mean, it's the not-for-profits that are leading the way, and this isn't an accident. So this is why, I think that any of us in the cybersecurity industry, we need to think really carefully about what we're spending our time doing. It's sort of like when people say, like with fair trade, it's like with the dollars you're paying, you're voting for the world that you want to live in. It's the same thing with working, with employment, because with the minutes of our time, we're also voting for the world that we want to live in by deciding who we want to spend that precious time with. And we need to teach. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, also looking to the time. I think it's a very hard question for everybody to make it to go with your open source a business model. But would you say that if we start sharing already, would that be a first good step?
Yes. So I think everyone has a role that they can play in all of this. Obviously, not everyone is immediately going to run to be a founder of a not-for-profit company. I'm not expecting this. However, there are things that you can do. Most certainly, promoting open source within your organizations is a really great one. Another thing that you can do as a corporation is introduce a social procurement policy. Another thing you can do is also put into place an open source procurement policy. When we're talking about, spending those dollars to vote for the world we want to live in, companies have far more dollars than we do. So, and basically procurement policy, that really determines, it's the companies and what they're asking for, plus governments and everyone else. This creates the demand gap, but and then the supply side basically jumps into that hole. So basically, by creating that demand, you are setting the tone for this world that we want to live in. If your RFP that you're preparing says that you want a really large accountancy firm that has all of the different large certifications, okay, that's what you're going to get. That's going to create that world, and create more of it. But if you instead say, I'm looking for a social enterprise that's doing things with open source, then you're basically going to, create more of that instead. So we need to be really conscious through the selecting our suppliers, in our role in promoting what kind of a world we're going to create. Same thing also with things like innovation departments, TTOs. If we think about spinning off parts of our companies, we can most certainly consider the usage of things like open source business models. You can ask, isn't this cannibalizing my company? Well, maybe, but it could also be transforming the company. So, bringing it back to the very beginning and the concept of avant-garde infosec, the whole idea with avant-garde is that you're creating things that are weird and absurd and different. Things that when you initially look at it, you don't entirely understand how it could work. It seems really unwieldy, but, and yet somehow it's still like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's not efficient, but it continues to function in this beautiful way. We can reconceive our notion of what we can do, with info security and with hacking and with business in general through this lens. We too can be artists with the ways that we're spending our time and the ways that also our companies are spending its money. So I hope that this all gives you some food for thought for today. And if any of you have any additional questions, you can either feel free to reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn. You can feel free to connect to me, send me a message. I'm really friendly and I usually respond. And yeah, for the rest, I hope that you all enjoyed this talk this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see already that you love the message. That's the first that is coming in the chat. And I do as well. Thank you very much for the inspiring words and a very refreshing, different viewpoint. I like it. Thank you very much. And then I think that if there are no questions, I don't see questions coming in at the moment. Just a lot of thanks and great inspiration. Then we slowly end this evening. Thanks again, Melanie.
You're welcome, and thanks again for the invite.
Yes.